All right, while we wait for Mr. Milovanov, I think we can already kick off the conversation and hopefully he'll join us in a few minutes. So welcome everybody from Ukraine, Germany and beyond. My name is Matthias Nellis and I'm with the Center for Liberal Modernity, where I'm responsible for the Ukraine work and among other things, the online magazine Ukraine Verstehen, Understanding Today. Ukraine Verstehen, excuse me. Today we're gathered to talk about the economic impact of the corona pandemic on Ukraine. It's our second online conversation. And last week we launched this format from our current quarantine to keep updates on developments in Ukraine. And we decided after last week's successful launch in German to continue the conversation and zoom into different facets and aspects of the corona pandemic. And today we're going to talk in depth about the economic impact of the pandemic for Ukraine and ordinary Ukrainians, Ukrainian business, the state's financial and macroeconomic stability, and the measures taken by the state to mitigate the economic hardship for people and businesses. And of course, we're going to talk about the crucial role of international assistance from the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and others. This is a conversation by or with economists for non-economists, for a general audience. So we'll try to be as simple as we can with terms and figures. If you have any questions throughout the conversations, please feel free to raise them through Facebook or the Q&A here in Zoom, and we'll address them throughout the conversation. And lastly, before we start, some updates and figures from the corona pandemic from Ukraine, because as everyone, we are looking at the numbers and the spread of the virus, and we are very concerned. So as of the 1st of April 2020, there are now nearly 670 cases of COVID-19 in Ukraine. And only in the last 24 hours, there were 120 new cases. So you see a spike of numbers that's very worrisome and a trend we should keep a close watch on. And lastly, I encourage everyone to also check the numbers of tests, which is at this present time still relatively low. There's only about 3,200 tests. So a comprehensive testing is just about to start. And then we'll have to see how the numbers develop. But now on today's topic, we brought together a stellar lineup of experts. And while we still wait for Mr. Milovanov, I will introduce VALERIJ PEKAR and David SAHA. VALERIJ is an entrepreneur and a public figure in Ukraine, who is also a lecturer at the Kiev Mohila Academy Business School and the Lviv Business School. David SAHA is with the German economic team and a consultant there, and he advises the Ukrainian and Georgian government on a high level with economic policies on behalf of the Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy of Germany. And Mr. Milovanov, who will join us shortly, at least we hope that, of course, is one of Ukraine's most famous economists and with extensive research experience in the United States and Germany, by the way. And he, of course, was, as many of you know, until recently, the country's economic or Minister for Economic Development, Energy and Trade. And he's an expert also in terms of policy. So we hope that he will join us later, at least, to talk about the measures. The conversation, there you are, Mr. Milovanov. Welcome also to you. The conversation will be opened by David SAHA, who agreed to frame today's conversation with a couple of slides. I promise you it will not be a too long and boring opening, but he decided to frame the conversation today in terms of where Ukraine stood at the beginning of this year, going into the pandemic, and provide some figures and expectation on where it is heading now with the pandemic. So without further ado, David, the floor is yours, and afterwards we come to VALERIJ and Mr. Milovanov.
Yes, good morning. I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me? Just as a check, perfect. Welcome to my study. It's a new way of presenting now, staring into a screen. I'll just try and put on the slides that I've presented here. That should come on in a second. And now hopefully that is there. I hope you can see the slides. Do you see something?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. So what I'm going to be talking about, and I'll try to keep it as short as possible, is the impact that this pandemic crisis has on the economy of Ukraine. I'll just go through a couple of relatively simple steps. We'll look a bit at the background. How did Ukraine enter this crisis? We'll look at the impact channels of how a pandemic is translating into a economic crisis, and it will be a crisis, and then look at some of the forecasts, and finally consider relatively briefly what the policy response should be, and I think that will be focused more in depth in the discussion that follows. So how did Ukraine come into 2020? It came into 2020 in very good shape by its own standards. There was a solid growth. All macro indicators essentially looked good. The economy grew at above 3% last year, which is still not stellar given the catch-up needs, but it's really quite good after the crisis that the country had experienced. And the expectation of growth was also solid for this year. Inflation was under control, the currency was stable, and even appreciated as foreign capital flowed into the domestic bond market. So foreign investors bought hryvnia-denominated bonds of the government. That really is a sign of trust in the economy. Also, the government had a very ambitious reform agenda. So basically, the basic indicators were really looking very good. There were some risks, of course. There was mainly the risks that the stability could be endangered by the IMF program not coming together. There was a staff level agreement, but not a final agreement on a program. And for investors, having the IMF in is usually a condition which they really demand in order to lend the country money. So that would really endanger the stability, and that was the main risk at the beginning of this year. There were also some attacks on the independence of the central banks from different sides that were somewhat worrying, because I think from an economic point of view, it's quite clear that the central bank, the NBU, did a very good job of managing the economy. And then the cabinet was also changed in early March, a move that most international observers saw with a lot of skepticism, also just because the other government didn't have much time to really complete anything in 180 days. And that coincided with the beginning of the Corona and COVID crisis, and therefore, of course, caught the Ukraine somewhat on an off footing. And then everything, of course, changed. Now, yes, can I change the slide? It works. And this crisis hit the world economy, or hit the world first of all. What's I think important to say is that at the moment, the economic impact comes not from COVID itself. It doesn't come from people being ill, and we hope it never will, because that, of course, would be a much worse tragedy than the economic tragedy. But for now, the impact of the crisis comes through the containment measures that countries are taking, the shutdowns that is basically shutting down not only social life, but also parts of the economy. And for Ukraine, it comes through a couple of channels. First of all, it comes from the domestic measures. The nation has a national quarantine that's lasting at least until April. And I think yesterday, the Interior Minister Avakov said it may last well into May. And that involves the closure of transport, personal transport, not goods transport, but all international air and train links, national train services, metros, and especially also all non-essential shops and gastronomy. So it closes down what's essentially 6% of the economy directly. Then it comes through the external sector. Exports will be lower. Some commodity prices important for Ukraine have fallen already. Steel price has fallen by 10% from an already pretty low base. Even the price for grains has fallen by 6%. It's not quite clear whether that comes from this crisis or it's some other factors, but it is down from the beginning of the year. And it's clear that also the demand for investment goods, for intermediate products, for example, the automotive supplies that Ukraine is delivering into the world economy, into the, especially also European car manufacturers, that this demand will be down and those companies will face a lack of orders. So exports will be down. Remittances are an important source of income for the Ukrainian economy. Labor migrants, Ukrainians working in other countries, now mainly in the EU, formerly more in Russia, but now mainly in the EU, contribute almost money corresponding to 8% of GDP per year into Ukraine. And that's important buying power. It's also an important source of money coming into the current account. And these 8%, well, in the second and third quarters, they may reduce very, very significantly. These people are often working in relatively precarious jobs. There are a lot in the service sector, some in the construction sector, both sectors are likely to be affected very heavily, and those incomes may simply not be there. Then foreign direct investment is not so big for Ukraine. Larger hopes were there for increasing it. It's usually around 0.5% of GDP per year coming in and helps to finance the current account deficit. It's not a part of it, but it helps finance it, so the country doesn't go into credit. And those streams are also likely to be very low, and the ambitious plans for increasing FDI in this year are certainly, basically certainly not going to work out. What's important then is the access to the international capital market. The government has funded its deficit in the last years also, and increasingly on capital markets. It could issue bonds to international investors and wasn't reliant on selling them to international financial institutions. Of course, the backing of IFIs, of the IMF in the back was important, otherwise probably the investors would have bought it, but it was possible for Ukraine to sell bonds on the international market, also some major companies. Those are the Euro bonds, and also now in the last time, of course, the domestic bonds. And that capital market access basically is, for the time being, it's probably stopped. The yields, measure of risk of those bonds, have soared from 6% up to 10%, and usually over 10%, and usually you say that after 10%, it's not possible to issue new bonds. So basically, Ukraine now doesn't have a way of financing itself on the market. On the other hand, one positive factor is that the oil price has really essentially collapsed, and energy imports make up around 20% of Ukraine's imports, and those are going to be cheaper. So that's what we call a positive terms of trade shock in a lot of negative shocks, but that at least helps Ukraine to somewhat balance out the lower exports. And then, of course, are the worrying second round effects. What will happen after this direct shock translates into the economy? There's a danger of reduced domestic demand. So after the combined supply shock internally and the demand shock from outside, domestic demand will probably fall as people expect lower incomes, companies expect lower incomes, and so on. And then the big danger, I think, is clearly that companies may go insolvent, jobs lost, and economic substance basically being lost for the economy, as the cash buffers of companies may simply not last them long enough to sustain this crisis. And that may finally also have a contagion into the banking system, that banks will increasingly have non-performing loans in their portfolios. So from this initial shock, it may translate into further shocks, and may translate into insolvent companies, loss of economic substance, and possibly at worst even a banking crisis, although that hopefully can be prevented. Banking sector, it should be said, was really cleaned up in the past years and is in pretty good shape, so hopefully it will be able to sustain this. So what are the expectations now for this year? Forecasts are out there. They range basically from expectation of negative growth for this year from 2.5%, the most optimistic, to 9% negative growth, the least optimistic I've seen so far. Government's own expectation is 3.9% GDP contraction, and I think in the budget law now it was slightly worse, 4.5% or something. But it basically means that the expectation of the toll that this crisis is taking on the economy would be between 6 or 12% down from the previous expectation of 3.5% of growth for this year. So that's really quite a severe crisis, for sure. And it should also be said, these estimates are, of course, still extremely shaky because they depend on external things. We do not know how long the initial shock, so the shutdown of the Ukrainian and other economies, will last. And then, of course, we also don't know how the policy response will be and how it will work. So that may all still change, but that's the present expectation, and that's the best we have to work with. This will also take an effect on the other economic variables. It's clear that the budget deficit will increase considerably. I think the past expectations were a deficit of 5 to 7% of GDP. I've now heard also an expectation of 10% of a deficit this year. With the falling GDP, revenues of the government will decrease. The tax revenues will decrease. At the same time, of course, there's also a need for higher expenditures. The question is how that all can be financed. We'll come to that in a moment, but it's clear such a crisis will have a considerably negative effect on GDP. At least 1 to 1, probably more. And then what will happen to the exchange rate? It has already started giving way. It's sort of partially recovered a bit, but because the National Bank is not managing the exchange rate directly, it's in charge of managing inflation. The exchange rate is essentially being allowed to float, and depreciation will help to balance the lack of exports in order to not get the current account out of control. So therefore, also as the exchange rate will probably be allowed to fall somewhat, that together with the oil price effect should hopefully help to keep the current account deficit under control. So meaning that Ukraine isn't in a lot of deficit vis-a-vis other countries at a moment in time where financing that deficit may prove very difficult indeed. At the same time, of course, allowing this depreciation means imports get more expensive, and that would temporarily lead to more inflation. It all really depends on the actions by the central bank, what they will do with their policy rate, and that's not an easy task because they can either decide to help domestic demand by lowering the rate, but that would increase inflation and it would allow the currency to fall even further, or they would really fight inflation and help the exchange rate, but therefore then they would have an even stronger negative effect on the economy. There's no simple way out for them. So that's basically the situation we have. It's really a hefty shock. It's at the moment the expectation is that it's less than the shock that was experienced in 2009. We should hope it stays that way. Now the question is, of course, what should be done? And I think the first priority that is quite clear is that the IMF agreement is the main priority. It's essential to prevent a government default in these times. There needs to roll over international debt of the country. There will be a higher budget deficit and there's no market access. So it's important that the IMF program is signed. There were very positive signs on Monday. The Privatbank law was finally passed, at least in first reading. The land market reform was passed, and a finance minister was put in place who's probably much more compatible with, so to say, with signing an IMF program. What then should the country actually do? I think that's mainly a task for the discussion. I'm already speaking for too long. There are some measures that the country has taken already, limited measures. There is a deferment of some tax measures. There is some social and illness assistance to individuals, but those are very limited measures. The question whether Ukraine should do really big measures of the sort that Germany is doing is a very difficult one indeed. There are many, many differences that come into play. Ukraine doesn't have the financial power of Germany. It is not able to simply raise money on the markets. At the same time, also, there is a huge administrative and institutional question there, because these programs need to be implemented. For example, giving liquidity to companies or paying short-term work. You actually need to be able to have the institutions like an economic development bank, which Germany has, but Ukraine really doesn't have, to make sure the money arrives there where it's needed and doesn't get funneled into places where you never wanted it to go. So that's really a difficult question. That's not simple to address. I hope MYLOVANOV will be able to give us more or his insights into what he thinks is possible there. What's clear is, at the same time, of course, these measures would be very, very helpful if they would work. Unless measures are taken, company bankruptcies and so on are going to pile up. I think that's clear. So Ukraine here is in a very difficult situation. It's not simple to decide whether something is possible and what should actually be done. So I think I'll conclude here. Thank you very much. I hope I wasn't too long.
That was fine. There was a slight delay and lag with the slides, but thank you, David, for covering a broad perspective, giving us many figures, which we'll come back to now in the discussion. I want to bring in now VALERIJ before we come to Mr. MYLOVANOV on the policies. David talked about the impact of the domestic measures and gave quite a lot of figures, but I want to nail it down to some of the specifics, because maybe you could break it down to what these measures have meant for the ordinary Ukrainians and small and medium businesses. This is a topic you care a lot about. So maybe in terms of unemployment and bankruptcies that David alluded to on a micro level, how has the crisis so far affected the Ukrainian economy and the ordinary Ukrainians?
Good morning, everybody. I would like to start with the emphasizing that Ukraine suffers now triple crisis in one. So it's epidemic, it's economic, and it's political. Epidemic, I have to say that the essentially smaller numbers in Ukraine than in Western Central Europe reflect the fact that so few tests were applied. So this reflects not a number of infected, but the number of tested. So the number of infected could be much, much greater. Economic crisis, I would like to share some figures which recently were published by 3 different analytical centers, Ukrainian Institute of the Future, and 2 big investment banks, Capital Times and Dragon Capital. They say that Ukrainian GDP will go down this year from 5 to 10% in the very pessimistic scenario, and that hryvnia rate will go to 30, and the economic revival will start probably on autumn. But there are still many, many variables, because the government declared no policy for the moment and clarified nothing, and there is a big discussion which I will disclose within a minute. And third crisis is the political crisis. We see that President loses the power. His presidential one-party majority in the parliament split it over IMF laws like so-called private bank law and land law, and also over assigning of some new ministers. And this political crisis is even deeper because the government suddenly was dismissed in the beginning of March, and new government was assigned in the start of the very tough times without key ministers. Just a few days ago, a new minister of economy appeared, and just on Monday, we saw the new normal minister of finances. So there is a big discussion now between the government and the business communities concerning quarantine and concerning those locking down. Because on the one hand, the government and many analysts say that the number of infected could go exponentially if we shall make economy more free and allow more companies to work. By the way, I have to say that yesterday the government allowed to food bazaars to be open, because food bazaar is the tool for self-sustainability and survival for many, many, many low-income people. And on the other hand, business communities say that if this locking down will continue, that unemployment will grow high, maybe up to 2 million people will lose their jobs, which will lead us to this most pessimistic scenario with downturn of 10% of GDP. And that means that budget will be, there will be not enough budget financing for public health, for social subsidies, and for many very important things, up to famine, which unfortunately in Ukraine in last century was a usual term under a usual event under Soviet rule. And it is very hard to imagine how it is possible in such an agricultural rich country as Ukraine, but we're speaking about family budgets which go dramatically down when people lose jobs because the state couldn't support them. According to last sociological poll, 57% of respondents say that they have money just for 4 weeks, and something like 20% more for second month. That means that half a year quarantine is not an option. So what business community offered is the concentration of quarantine of risk groups, like elder people, like people with chronic diseases, and to support them with food delivery and so on, and to revive economic activity with strong sanitary requirements, which indeed could not protect totally people from being infected. And it is very important, the very important part of the discussion is local budgets, which now lose a lot of money because of unprofessional decision of the government to cancel taxes on land and real estate, which forms local budgets. And now local budgets which bear responsibility for many, many social programs, they lost a lot of money. So then there is a certain consensus among analytical centers and centers of economic thought in Ukraine that the absolute priority for Ukraine in the moment is to keep employment. Because to keep employment means that more and more households will survive this crisis without specific losses. And to support only risk groups, indeed there are different points of view. This discussion is still in progress. And then I can say that government measures and measures taken by the parliament are not enough absolutely. So the vision of the consensus vision, let's say, of analysts is that the state should support only those who couldn't survive by themselves, and to make much more free all those who survive by themselves. First of all, we're speaking about micro business, about self-employed people. There are millions of self-employed people in Ukraine, which provide them a chance to survive this crisis and feed their families. And I would like to remind, just finishing this short speech, that Ukraine now is the last country in Europe according to Economic Freedom Index. The rating is 134, and the countries with such a low economic freedom indeed couldn't survive crisis. And the good question is not how much the economy could survive in lockdown, but how much people could survive. This is a question. Thank you.
Thank you, Valery, for pointing out to this. I want to re-emphasize the last point, and I thank you for bringing up the sociological poll, which I would have otherwise been citing. But again, Valery, a follow-up question. You were citing the unemployment numbers that could go up to the millions, but maybe you can illustrate how many people have already lost their job during the quarantine, and where we stand at the moment with the official unemployment rate, just to give the listeners and viewers a perspective on where we stand.
I don't want to provide you with official figures because there is a big unofficial unemployment. What I would like to put on the table is that according to polls among business communities, like European Business Association and Union of Ukrainian Entrepreneurs, up to 50% of companies already see certain downturn in their sales and in their activities. And something like 25% see that they should now dismiss some people and decrease salaries.
All right. Now it's time to bring in Mr. Milovanov. Just adding to the figures, I mean, there are wild figures all around, but just to give some additional figures to what you just said, Valery. The Ukrainian Chamber of Commerce and Industry stated that until this moment, about 700,000 Ukrainians have lost their job during the beginning of the quarantine. So 700,000 people. And now, Mr. Milovanov, again, thank you for joining us. Before we come to the policy responses of the state, I want to get your perspective on what the pandemic and the measures taken to curb the pandemic mean for ordinary Ukrainians and businesses. And you're still muted, Mr. Milovanov.
Ukraine follows more or less the mainstream response to the crisis as it should. We are proposing both macroeconomic, monetary, and fiscal response. In terms of monetary policy, this central bank continues to ease the monetary policy. That, of course, is all conditioned on the IMF package, and there are some issues with that. If that doesn't go through, the central bank would be forced to tighten the policy. But so far, the inclination is to continue to ease the interest rates. And that's consistent with the measures taken by other central banks in the world. Similarly, the government is proposing several percent of the GDP fiscal stimulus. The nominal value is 125 or something like similar to that. That hasn't yet been approved, but 125 billion hryvnias, which is approximately 2.5% of GDP. Now, that compares to 5 to 9 to 10% of GDP response in developed countries, but the nominal response in Ukraine doesn't take into account the vacations on paying taxes and some indirect measures. So if we take them into account, I also expect that the total fiscal response will be in the amount of 5 to maybe 7 or maybe even more % of GDP. Now, what does it mean for specific, people, for individuals and companies? First of all, there are some changes in taxation. So there are delays in when you have to pay taxes. Some payroll taxes specifically are forgiven for a period of the crisis. Also, there is unemployment support, unemployment benefits. That's also typical. Most countries or many countries offer that. So Ukraine is moving there too. Although the amount of support is somewhat limited, but that's due to the fiscal space that Ukraine has. And at the same time, it's not always direct. That's due to, unlike in other countries, usually the unemployment benefits get paid directly to the workers. Some of temporary leave benefits are being paid in Ukraine to the companies rather than workers, and there's some bureaucracy and some non-monetary barriers to it, and so there should be deregulation, and the government is working on it, but it might take some time, and it has to do more with the sort of history of the institutions of the unemployment benefits in Ukraine. So some deregulation has to take place. And also in terms of taxation, there's some either populism or maybe vested interest, because some of the taxes which have been forgiven are a little bit unorthodox. So it's mostly on real estate and land, which is a bit bizarre because the idea is to support actually operations rather than the assets, holdings, and make operations more attractive, economic activity, and at the same time also support the more vulnerable parts of the economy and people. And that's definitely not the holders of the assets, such as real estate or land. But more or less, I would say that in 80% of measures are more or less standard. The question is really if the government is able to move forward quickly enough and provide those direct payments to workers who might be laid off or who might be put on temporary leave with or without pay. That's, I think, where the critical moment is, or critical issue is. In terms of unemployment, those 700,000, that's an estimate and that's not a confirmed number. The estimates of the unemployment are at the 1.5, 1.6 million people. That's 8.6% unemployment. The macroeconomic forecast of the government brings it to 9.6 from the previous forecast 8.1 when the things were looking rosy. But that's probably a conservative estimate. Mm-hmm. At the same time, while we see that companies are reporting they're putting workers on leave or preparing to maybe take some across the board cost-cutting measures, we do not necessarily see yet the layoffs. At the very same survey that Valery was referring to, or maybe even David was referring to, about how many people have enough financial assets to survive 2 months or 1 month of quarantine or being unemployed. So the number is actually staggering, 57%. 57% of people who were surveyed have 4 weeks of savings or less. So that means there would be even potential for social unrest if the government doesn't step in swiftly. But the very same survey shows that only 0.5% of people who were surveyed lost jobs. That suggests that the companies have not yet started firing people. So there's some delay or inflexibility, rigidity in the labor markets. We continue to monitor that. I'm in contact with the survey companies which are doing this, and we will see the new numbers actually have to come out today. And we will know if the layoffs started. So, but more or less the response is standard. I think the risks are, the entire world is suffering from the crisis. So in that sense, Ukraine is not alone. But what's specific or unique to Ukraine is the ability of the government to cope with it, and whether there will be an additional political crisis, driven by reshuffling of the government or accusations of corruption, invested interest, and such things. You know, the usual business in Ukraine. There's always a political crisis in Ukraine.
Okay, I want to follow up on that, Mr. Milovanov, because we want to talk now about instruments in policy a little bit more, and then come to the IMF and then open it up to the audience. By the way, ask questions throughout the conversation, and we will direct these questions to the speakers. But Mr. Milovanov, you said we were talking about the limited savings, and I want to ask you about instruments at the moment. How do people who work unofficially or even in FOPs or those who are laid off, what are the instruments to channel direct financial assistance to them? Where do we stand with that?
The standard mechanism, which is used in, in all countries and should be used in Ukraine, in my view, is the centers or funds which pay unemployment benefits. So there is a system, an institution, or actually a number of institutions where you can report that you are being unemployed, and then you will get benefits. You have to register there. The government recently deregulated the process of registering. You can just call in, and then they will check it with the tax authorities. And once it's verified, then you will be able to be paid. That all can be done online or or on the phone. But the same mechanism can be used in principle for the self-employed, or those workers who were laid off, but they were registered as private entrepreneurs or independent contractors. So that's not yet, or at the moment, it's not in the regulations, in the law, but it's easy to modify the law and suggest that, guys, if you have been a private entrepreneur and your income went down to a certain amount, and you currently getting the amount of revenue or the amount of income below certain threshold, then you register with the very same center. The center verifies, this is a center of Центр занятости, the center of employment. They're usually engaged in trying to help you find a new job if you are unemployed. But they also confirm that you are being registered there, and that's how you receive your unemployment benefits. So that mechanism can be used. You essentially, as an entrepreneur, we need to change the regulation for that. But as an entrepreneur, you can follow the very same process. You register with the center verifies with the tax authorities, and maybe with the bank in which you are registered. And once you have tax records and the financial documents, and that all can be obtained online, given the permission of the entrepreneur, then you can verify the income or revenue of the entrepreneur, and if it's below a threshold, that person can be registered and start getting paid using the same mechanism. So infrastructure is there.
Okay, I want to now again open it up to the others. There was a question from Stefan Kegerbein here in Zoom regarding looming or possible restrictions of flow of capital. So will there be, do you expect capital flows of capital restrictions? And his question is specifically regarding international mother companies and Ukrainian daughter companies. Are there?
I don't think there will be restrictions. The central bank is not intended to do that. The macroeconomic special capital flow situation is manageable. Ukraine had 26 billion of USD reserves in the central bank, which for Ukraine is a considerable amount. I think it's the highest in probably since 2013 that it had prior to 2014 crisis. Although the amount there in 2010, 2011 was 30, 40. Still 26 was sufficient. During this crisis, the first several weeks or months and a half, because it was a reshuffling of the government, which was the first trigger. Some companies tried to exit or maybe rebalance their portfolio of holdings. And then with coronavirus, we are down now to 24. 2 billion of reserves have been sold to maintain the market stability. The hryvnia devalued by 11 or so%, which is at the bottom of top 10 countries in terms of devaluation in the region. So it's actually doing much better than neighbors. And the panic or pressure on the currency has subsided. Now it's the exchange rate is fluctuating. there might be an indirect effect or indirect push for capital controls. And so there would be the issue, let's say, if the monetary policy and it's already being eased, capital requirements are being eased, buffer requirements are being eased, that basically may give an opportunity to some of the banks or some of the companies to redistribute additional, what's now doesn't have to be reserved in the capital, it actually will be accounted as profit. So they can try to distribute it as dividends, and foreign companies can try to move it outside of the country. If that becomes a systemic approach to easing of reserves, so the structural problem will be that you basically ease reserve requirements in the banks, but banks don't lend more. Instead of that, they try to exit with that amount of the capital. So then the central bank might have to step in with some regulations. But at this point, you see the structure of the crisis is unusual for Ukraine as for the entire world, because usually what happens in Ukraine is that there is an exogenous out-of-country shock or internal political shock. But everywhere else, everything is fine, or at least in the developed countries, and the capital starts fleeing. Now we have both supply and both demands on both parts inside and outside of the country shrinking. So in that sense, we expect that the exchange rate balance will stay. And while some capital has left the country, it probably will be very moderate. So the central bank doesn't see any issues yet.
Okay, thank you. There's a direct question that's maybe for David or Valerie from Rebecca Harms. She was asking, and David, you were referring to that in your introduction about the remittances. So hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians, Rebecca Harms writes, have been working abroad, and most of them returned to Ukraine. And legally or illegally, they worked in Poland, Germany, Czech Republic, and so on. So their remittances, you said, made up 8% of GDP, David. So how do you evaluate these losses caused? So, and is there a discussion in the EU how to deal with this problem of remittances in the future? Maybe you can address that.
Yes. What's clear is that the remittances previously were an important source of income. They're not a part of GDP. That's not production that's taking place in Ukraine, but they're an important source of income, and they basically help to finance the life of Ukrainian families. They help to finance the imports, and they will be down for some time for sure. Whether that's going to return back to normal is a bit of a big question. Probably yes. We hope that everything comes back afterwards, but of course we don't quite know whether patterns are going to change afterwards. I think for now that there is no discussion really about this. There is very little that could be done. I think many migrants were in relatively unsafe jobs, so they would have, even if they had stayed abroad, those jobs would be lost. I mean, some of them, of course, working informally. That's the same problem also in Ukraine. An informal job is the first one to be lost, right? And I think that's also for some Ukrainians, the envelope payments right now, they're simply not coming anymore. It's two-hander. It helps companies survive, but it really makes the lives of people, of course, worse very quickly without showing up in official figures. I think for now, it's just another part of the shock. It means Ukraine has less income. It doesn't get any unemployed inside the country, but Ukrainians who were outside the country are now unemployed and coming back. So in a way, it works relatively similar as the reduction of export demand. You could think of it almost as another export that is ceasing to flow. It used to be sort of a source of employment, although outside, and a source of income. So it's basically, it just adds on, and there's very little that can be done about it in the short run.
All right. Maybe, Valeria, I want to come back to you
my apologies. Can I just comment? So,
of course.
What is the magnitude of this effect in terms of coming back? The Polish press reports that it's about 20% of Ukrainians. The border control reports that over the last several weeks during the key just before the closure of the borders, about 400,000 people or so returned, which is consistent with numbers in the area of 20%. So it's not that 80% or 100% of people, it's only 1/5 of people is coming back to Ukraine at this stage. The question, of course, becomes what happens to the employment in those areas where they are now. So if there's a significant reduction, the effect will be stronger, but the effect is not as big as some might have feared.
Thank you for clarification. There's actually a question by Julia Eichhofer but I want to direct it first to Valery and then to Mr. Milovanov. It regards the IMF, which all of you, I think, have touched upon. But on Monday, the land market, and we'll come to that, Mr. Milovanov, because you were the one advocating for the reform, but I want to begin with Valery. The land market reform was passed in the second reading, and the banking law was passed in the first reading. So the question regards, how do you view those adoptions? Are they enough to unlock aid from the IMF? And how important, I mean, David touched upon that, but how important is the IMF aid for Ukraine in this moment? Why don't you open, Valery, and then we come to Mr. Milovanov.
Thank you. As already was mentioned, in last December, Ukraine already had staff-level agreement with IMF. So it looked very nice, and the government, which was dismissed, which has Mr. Milovanov as a Minister of Economy, shows good results for first quarter, for first month of this year. But indeed, there were several requirements of IMF. First of all, the law on private bank, which officially is calling the law which prohibits returning of nationalized banks to their bankrupt former owners. In Ukrainian political discussions, it simply is called anti-Kolomoisky law, because first of all, we are speaking about private bank of Mr. Kolomoisky. And second, indeed, is a land reform. I would like to remind to our participants that Ukraine has no transparent land market for 19 years. And this ban was made in the form of moratorium. So it was postponed and postponed every year to solve this problem. And now we have this 19-year fight for open market, and very big fight during the last 6 years after revolution of dignity to finally make this market open and transparent. Indeed, the reform is dramatically cut because it is not so popular, neither among poor people, which consider this as the, how to say, penetration of capitalism in their lives, which they sometimes, especially those of them who have post-Soviet very leftist views, don't welcome, and big oligarch groups which would like to use non-transparent character of the market. So the reform was cut because during first 2.5 years, only Ukrainian citizens could buy land, and then only Ukrainian companies with only Ukrainian founders. And there are great limits on land, 100 hectares for one owner. And state land will not be for sale, just those people who have private land could now transparently sell it. What does it mean, 100 hectares? It is very, very small amount, because in Ukraine, break-even point for agricultural farming is something like 500 hectares. If you have less, you should go to very niche market, niche cultures, agricultural cultures, and so on. And 60% of Ukrainian land is now owned and processed by mid-sized farmers, medium-sized farmers who have from 10 to 40,000 of hectares. So this is not so big plots, but this is enough to make profitable enough agriculture.
Valery, maybe I can cut you here and just ask whether, from your perspective, the land reform is enough to satisfy the IMF. This light version is enough to satisfy the IMF.
I think so, because first of all, this has less economic but very big social impact. So finally, the last rests of, let's say, feudalism are over. This is very important for Ukrainian social life and psychological life.
Okay, and I want to turn to Mr. Milovanov, because you were a part of the previous government, and I want to get your perspective on the Lex Kolomoisky, as it is called, and the important light land version or land agricultural market reform. So briefly, how do you evaluate that? Will it allow the IMF aid to come? And will it even have an effect, positive effect on the economy, the agricultural reform market in this light version after the crisis is over?
In the current form, the land market will not have any significant or substantive effect on the economic development. It will have a cultural and political and even maybe sort of worldview effect, because in the political discourse up until 2018, the discussion was not about how much to sell and whom to sell, but about that the land cannot be a part of any market. Similar to many countries, in fact, most countries in the world, essentially not willing to talk about market for organs, for kidneys, or for, I'm not bringing that in, I'm just trying to make a parallel how Ukrainians would say, land is not a good, it cannot be traded. While in fact, there was a shadow market operating at full speed and not very efficient and allowing to create monopolies or concentration of land in some way. So the answer to the first question is no, the economic effect is limited, but the political effect is substantive, and it probably in all likelihood opens the door to further reform. So after a while, people will see that the sky has not fallen, and therefore maybe we can actually decrease or in some way relax the restrictions. At the same time, the structure of the market is very problematic. It carries a high risk of two issues. First of all, there might be a privatization similar to the unsuccessful privatization of 90s, where the state-owned companies were privatized through physical entities, through people who were limited in the amount of shares they could hold. That was called voucher privatization, coupon privatization of 90s, and it was a disaster. It basically allowed creation of oligarchs, because oligarchs, people with cash, were able to buy for essentially nothing these vouchers, and they ran schemes of nominee holders, of those vouchers. So something can happen here. And the second one is the disruption. Once you have a physical person who can buy 100 hectares and no one else can buy, let's say you operate 5,000 hectares of land as a farm, and you're renting all of this, and I'm going to buy in the middle of your field 100 hectares, I will be able to hold you up. So these are two risks. The risk of further concentration through shadow schemes, through nominal holders of land, and the second, what market hold up or disruption. These two issues, I believe, will be strongly opposed both by the World Bank and by the IMF, and for these very good reasons. And therefore, we are quite not over the hill with the IMF package.
All right, and following up on that very briefly, Mr. Milovanov, there's a question regarding Kolomoisky. So obviously, probably he will not be able to be compensated for the nationalization of Privat, but how do you view the relationship of Mr. Kolomoisky and the government or the presidential administration, very briefly?
I have never spoken in my position and actually in my life, but specifically in my position as the minister, I have never spoken with Mr. Kolomoisky. I have not experienced any direct pressure, threats, hints from Mr. Kolomoisky or from any other major oligarch, although there has been pressure of all kinds. At the same time, I know that people around me have spoken to him and have experienced some threats and pressure. So in that sense, Kolomoisky is there, he is felt quite strongly, and he is very adept in creating chaos. He's pursuing currently an isolationist, protectionist agenda for Ukraine on the political level, but he's clearly in the minority in Ukraine among all, even vested interests, and therefore I expect him not to win.
Okay, thank you. There's another question now to Mr. SAHA or David regarding the increased demand for nurses or and Erntehelfer, those helping with agricultural farming in Germany. So after the crisis subsides, is there a special is it to be expected that Germany will hire more Ukrainians and Ukraine will benefit from the flow of workers to Germany?
Yes. Honestly, I do not think that this will take place or that it would benefit Ukrainians. These agricultural harvest workers were usually very often from Poland or other Eastern EU countries who simply have the right to work in Germany. They're now being shut out because of the closed Schengen borders. So
and the nurses?
That's more of a long-term, I mean, there would be possibly some long-term developments because we lack staff in the care sector. Less nurses directly than actual care staff, where Germany really needs more people to look for the elderly and so on. That's a long-term development. In the long term, it's quite possible that Germany will open its borders more to Ukrainians as well. The current laws do not really help very much with that. There was a law that was being passed end of last year that allows skilled workers with a vocational education compatible to the German one to enter the country. But this passage of compatible to the German one is a formal one. So you need to really have the same vocational education. Almost no one has that. So the current law wouldn't really allow many people to come in. So at the moment, I think the best thing that would happen is things returning back to normal, in which not many Ukrainians were really working in Germany, at least not formally. And I think in the long run, yes, we can see that there are some pressures which would work in favor of opening German borders more to Ukrainians, but it's not in the books yet.
Mm-hmm. And last question from the audience, and then I'll wrap it up. This is again from Marie-Louise Beck, either for Valery or Mr. Milovanov. Marie-Louise Beck, head of the co-director of Litmot, she's asking about agricultural holdings at the moment, profitable ones. How do they make use of a lease system if they want to cater to more than 100 acres? How does it work at the moment, and how will it be affected, and their work be affected by the new law? Maybe Valery or Mr. Milovanov. You're still muted, Mr. Pekar.
I would like to say that probably they will try to lease land which they cannot buy, and like they do this today. Indeed, this is not very sustainable, but taking into account limitations, that's the only way to for them to be productive. Because these big holdings, they work in agricultures, let's say, which where scale is necessary, like grain, like corn, and so on. And indeed, they need much more than 100 hectares. Thousands times much more. Thank you.
Okay, there are many more questions, or there were several more questions regarding agriculture. In light of the time, I have to cut it short here, and maybe we will do a session on agricultural reform and what this law really means for the agriculture a little later. But I really have to cut it at this point because we're trying to make it as short as possible and no longer than 60 minutes. Mr. Milovanov, I'll give you each an opportunity for the very short closing statement, but just want to say that obviously looking at the economy is very difficult at the moment to give real prognosis. Everything depends on the length of the quarantine, and at the moment it's very clear how long the quarantine will be upheld in Ukraine. So maybe each of you a short closing statement. Mr. Milovanov, why don't you go first?
The Ukrainian government response is adequate for now. The question is whether the budget deficit which is needed for that response will be financeable. For that, Ukraine needs the IMF, the World Bank, and the European Union, as well as other partners' support. Currently, we need to pass the banking law in the second reading. And also there are issues about the land market reform. Those two hurdles are overcome. Ukraine will weather well through the crisis. If they are not, there will be a much more difficult situation.
Thank you. Valery, you're muted.
So I have nothing to add, sorry.
Okay, David, last closing words.
I'm in full agreement with Mr. Milovanov. I think it's crucial for the government to stay able to act in order to really help people and companies through this extremely challenging situation of uncertainty and possibly of shutdown for some time. And for that, I think the IMF agreement is crucial really in preserving the government's ability to act. So I think watch the 7th of April. Let's hope the Kolomoisky law really gets passed, because I think that is now the main hurdle that needs to be passed. And afterwards, that should at least preserve the ability to act. Thank you.
Excellent closing words. I want to thank you, gentlemen, for this interesting session. It was quite demanding for the audience, with many of terms that non-economists may or may not know. So I hope you could follow the discussion, and I want to encourage everyone to reach out to us to suggest topics for next sessions. We will Zoom. We already planned sessions on the healthcare system, the state of civil society in the crisis. But if you have ideas for further sessions, please reach out to us. With all of that, again, thank you to the panel, and stay healthy and good luck. Goodbye.